Hey guys, Mr. Tweak here. So in this section, we're going over kind of the classical and Keynesian kind of alternatives to the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. The reality is that we're only going to briefly touch on these. We're not going to be using them a whole lot. In the next section, we're going to be right back to aggregate supply, aggregate demand. But you do need to know, occasionally you'll get a question on the AP test or an FRQ question where they'll ask you to do something from the classical point of view or using the classical model. Now, the classical model, really simple, right? That's our X and Y axis. We've still got price level. We've still got output over here, right? The difference is that with our classical model, it's that idea of, you can make what you can make with your resources and there is no short run. It's just all like, there is no long run, there is no short run. It's just all what you can make right now with your resources, fixed amount. So aggregate supply is a vertical line, and then aggregate demand doesn't really matter in the classical model. Here you've got aggregate demand, and when aggregate demand shifts, it just leads to a new price level. That's it. Output doesn't really move. You're always going to have your full employment output, and it's not going to move. And then you're just going to have, an equilibrium price level that's always changing and adjusting to a new equilibrium. So this is the classical model. This was before the Great Depression. In the 1800s, this was kind of the view of macroeconomics. Now, there is a school of thought known as the Austrian school. That's where F.A. Hayek comes from, Ludwig von Mises. Some other, famous economists come from the Austrian school. They're kind of neoclassical. They're trying to bring back the classical all along, right? So all throughout, the 1930s and on, they're trying to kind of be these neoclassical proponents, right? And the idea that they basically have is, look, this is simple, it's elegant. If we leave it alone, it will fix itself quickly. The problem that we run into is they view kind of like, governments trying to solve economic problems being the biggest problem of all. So the Austrian school, still a school of thought of economics around today, they tend to be kind of very simplistic in their view of the economy. It's just we can produce what we can produce, and if we just leave it alone, prices will go up, prices will go down, and we will we'll be at full employment pretty quickly. In the 1800s, it was really common for prices to go up, prices to go down, prices to go up, prices to go down. And that has a lot to do with kind of the gold standard and what we made our money out of back then. The Austrian school tends to be big proponents of the gold standard. They want to kind of go back to that idea, whereas most modern economists have kind of, they've moved on. There might be some neoclassicists who don't really, believe that the gold standard could work currently, but they have, other ideas of what we should do with our currency so that it's no longer fiat, something we'll be getting into in Unit 7. So that's the classical model. The Keynesian model is basically the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, but it's just kind of drawn a little bit differently. Now, I'm not going to do a whole bunch with it. There's some econ teachers where they teach the Keynesian model and that's what the students learn mostly. And then they get like oh yeah, by the way, here's the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, another way of showing pretty much the same thing. For the Keynesian model, right, we've got our curve, our price level output, right? Same thing as aggregate demand supply, same thing as the classical model. The difference here is like the Keynesian model takes the short run curve, the supply curve, and the long run supply curve and kind of combines them into one curve. So the idea is like, yeah, there's like a theoretical maximum that you can't produce more. So you're never going to get past like that point on your x-axis unless something happens. You find more resources or new technology or whatever, right? So there's some portion that we can't get past. Then there's a portion where it's kind of like the short run supply curve in that where there's a little bit of like, prices can go up and can go down so that if the demand goes down, prices go down and the economy kind of adjusts itself within a certain range. But then the idea is like, workers aren't going to take more than a 10% pay cut. Businesses aren't going to cut their prices by more than 10%. People are stubborn. They'd rather lose their job than take a 20% pay cut. They'd rather lose their business than cut prices by 20%. So there's a certain level that prices can't go below. So like in the Keynesian model, there's like a limit on the lower end on prices, and there's a limit on the upper end on production. Like we can't go past a certain point up for production, and we can't go down a certain point on prices. And that is what makes up our aggregate supply curve. And then aggregate demand moves, anywhere along here. So that as long as aggregate demand is right in the middle of that intermediate range, aggregate demand goes up and goes down, price level goes up and goes down, output goes up and goes down, it moves around, whatever, right? But then like at a certain point, if aggregate demand just keeps going up, all you're getting is just more inflation, more inflation, more inflation. And at a certain point when aggregate demand goes down, this is the real kicker, prices just freeze. They won't fall below a certain point. So if aggregate demand shrinks enough, there's nothing to get us out of that situation. And that's the real idea of Keynes, is that if you have a real bad aggregate demand problem, somebody else has got to come in and fix that. The market's not going to fix itself. So that's the Keynes model. Now, you do need to know the classical range, the intermediate range, and the Keynesian range. The reason why you need to know those is because sometimes you get like multiple choice questions where they'll tell you aggregate demand is currently in the classical range. That tells you that we've got an inflationary gap if aggregate demand is anywhere in here. Or if they tell you aggregate demand is currently in the Keynesian range, you know we have a recession if we're in that area there. You might not even use the Keynesian graph to answer the question, but you need to know if we're in the Keynesian range, that's a recession. If we're in the classical range, then that's going to be an inflationary gap. And if we're in the intermediate range, we're going to be close to full employment. Ideally, you're getting as close to that inflection point right there as possible. But as long as you're close, you're at like full employment. So that's the classical model. The Keynesian model, we're not going to do a ton with those this year. You do need to know them in case they pop up as like, a lot of times they pop up on an FRQ as just kind of like an add-on, like, oh yeah, by the way, draw the classical model, if you will, please. So anyways, classical model, Keynesian model, tomorrow we're getting back to aggregate demand, aggregate supply. So there you go. All right, have a good one, guys.